I'm Ken Rockwell. Let's take a look at some tricks and secrets about what I do with my Z6 III to get great results. I'll teach you how to operate the camera, but to learn how to take great pictures, I suggest looking at my website and follow the link to how to take great pictures, and that link is in my description here. First, let's get this charged. Yes, we can pop the battery out of the bottom and stick it in an external charger, but that was what our grandparents did. Today, we charge by USB-C, and the only trick is it only charges while it's off. It also can power from this, but there's no light. You see, the charge light hasn't even come on yet. Let's see if it comes on at all. It's got to be off. See, finally came on. It takes a while and takes its sweet time to turn on. It won't charge while the camera is on. However, if you put the camera down while it's set to on, it will eventually go to sleep, unless you deactivated that, and will start to charge. The gotcha is that the green light on the back doesn't light up. It's got this hidden light here, which is really hard to find. It only charges over USB-C from USB-C. You can't use a USB-A, the old rectangular style cord, to USB-C and expect it to charge. What's a little weird is if you leave the camera on and it goes to sleep, the battery icon here will continue to show, but it doesn't update. It's weird because if you plug the camera in and the battery is less charged, and you walk away, even though the battery can charge and get to 100% and shut off, the icon won't update unless you tap the shutter button to wake up the camera again. That's, I think, a defect, but just to let you know that if you keep coming back and it still says it's like 20% charged, it's probably charged much more. Just tap the shutter button to wake it up and get the updated icon shown. Autofocus settings. You can go crazy with these autofocus settings. I don't. A few things I set, and by the way, all of this is explained in print on my website, which is the smartest place to go. This YouTube video is fun, but if you really want to see what's going on, I would go to kenrockwell.com, follow the link in my description, where all these things are spelled out so you can follow them in your own time. I will cover how to program the function buttons. I programmed my second function button to be autofocus. So you'll know now I have autofocus selected, and by using the front and rear dials, I can make it do whatever I want it to do. The way I make this work well is notice that I've only got two modes here. Single sensor or all sensors automatic selection. The way we limit those modes is we go into Menu, Custom, A for Focus, then A8 limits what modes are selected. Notice how I've deselected all of them except the two that I use. Or 3D tracking only comes up in the AF continuous. That makes it a lot easier to use. So instead of having to click through all of these when you're shooting, and you know, I don't know what any of these are either. I really don't care. There's always a lot of stuff that's put in as Nikon has developed the cameras over the years, and they don't not to take stuff out. They leave it in. So find the ones you like and keep it simple because you shouldn't have to make it complicated. AFS is single focus. It focuses and locks. AFC is continuous focus, where it gets focus and then it tracks it in and out. And the difference between AFC and AFS is the focus in and out mode, the Z-axis, so to speak, in, out, in, out, in, out. If you wanted to track left and right and up and down, those are different axes. I'll use the 3D tracking mode in still photos. Instead of having to scoot around and move the autofocus areas around, I'll simply use the 3D tracking mode, lock onto what I want, and then I'll recompose just by turning my camera. So I don't have to do anything to do that. How clever is that? I just press the shutter halfway down to grab focus, cruise over there, and I'm good to go. Something very useful that this camera does, which all the Nikon should do, but they don't, is instead of having to use this idiotic thing to click around like it's 1972 before mice were invented for computers, it's much better, even when you're looking through the finder, to be able to use this as a linear touchpad that moves the sensor exactly where you want it. To set that, we go to the Custom Settings menu, go to Controls, F4, Touch Functions, turn Touch Functions on, and you should be good to go. You want to assign it to move the focus point with touching it. And for practicality's sake, when you're shooting horizontally, just have this part of the screen be active because when your face is here, you don't want to be sticking your finger in your eye off on the left-hand side of the screen. And I prefer that when I'm in the vertical mode, then the entire screen works for setting focus points. And that's not for when you're looking at the screen. It's hard to show here in video. When you're looking through the finder, doing this on the blank screen will get your selected focus point to move all over the place exactly linearly how you want it. And that's really what you want to do, as opposed to clicking around, click, 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 which takes longer and it's less precise. In the beginning, Nikon made what I thought was a mistake, was that in AFC, they had the focus points turn red when they were in focus. That made no sense. To me, I want green, which means go. To set that, we go into the custom settings menu. We go to the focus. We go to A10, focus point display, and this makes no sense. But when you see AFC and focus display, turn it to on, and now the points will turn green when they're in focus and working well, as opposed to turning red. Here's another important setting. By default, the camera sets so it shoots really fast, which looks good in demos, but means you may get very few shots in focus when there's a moving subject, because it'll just keep shooting in AFC even though it's not in focus. Let me show you the second one, which by default is where we want it. For AFS, priority selection means when you say focus, that means it only takes the picture if it's in focus for AFS mode. That makes sense, and that's the way the camera's preset. What I disagree with is for AFC, continuous autofocus, it's oftentimes set to focus plus release. Release means it goes off anytime you press that shutter button. It doesn't care. It's like battle short on a battleship, if you're familiar with that. It just ignores any problems and just goes. That sounds good, but it also means if it's out of focus, you'll get 300 pictures out of focus. If you set focus priority, that means it only fires if it's actually in perfect focus as you're tracking something. That is a good place to be, although it may be disconcerting because it'll be shooting many fewer frames. You hear that stupid noise it keeps making? That annoys me to no end, because while I'm shooting, I put the camera down, and then it makes that noise, and it just does not sound comfortable. It is inelegant. That is the stabilizer system moving the sensor around when it turns itself on and off. In any case, focus plus release is not a bad compromise, but just know that these settings are here, and that's what they do. If you want rear button autofocus, I don't, but when you press AF on is the only time the camera will focus. The way we set that is we go to custom setting, autofocus, AF6, AF activation. Here's the controls for what turns on autofocus. Normally, the shutter button or the AF on button turns on autofocus. If you set it to AF on only, it'll ignore a half press of the shutter button to focus with the rear button. In custom settings for the different buttons, you can set the AF on button to be any of the buttons you want. If you'd rather have a different button, do that. What does this monitor control button do? Normally, it automatically selects Finder LCD. Finder LCD. You put your face here, Finder LCD. If you want to lock it to only one, like for instance, make sure the LCD never turns on if you don't want to annoy others in the dark, or vice versa, you get that by pushing this repeatedly. And there's a few modes, and as you push it, you can't see that, monitor only, Finder only, an automatic display switch. That's how we select those. There's a Finder size option that lets you reduce the size of the live view image in the Finder so you can be a little bit further away and still see the whole image. And that is hidden in Menu, Setup, Viewfinder Display Size. See, standard. Now, I can't really show you this with the viewfinder. Standard means it has a large live view image. Small makes a smaller live view image. So again, you can be further away from the eyepiece. The menus actually are always a little bit smaller in the Finder because they're big enough, and this way you can still see them from further away. How do you know if the shutter went off? In the silent modes, you've got your options here. Back to custom settings. D, shooting display. D15. Release timing indicator means how do you know if the shutter went off? You can choose the type of display, and it displays, you can play with these at home, and that controls if the Finder blinks or blanks or shows lines or whatever you want. Level display options. Normally to get the level display, you just hit the display button several times. You'll see you get different sets of displays. There's the option with the level display. This is the type A level display. If you'd rather have a line along the side and along the bottom, again, we go to the shooting display section here. We go to D18, virtual horizon type, and it even shows you what the two types are. To program what all the buttons do. For instance, I program this button to control the image area because I don't shoot movies with these cameras. This is in custom settings, F controls, and F2 and F3 is where you set what they do in shooting and in playback. Likewise, you can control what menu you get when you press this button, what items are up there with the F1 menu function. You can control what this extra ring does on your lens. That's in the same, the F controls, F2 shooting, and you'll notice among the many choices are the lens control ring. For exposure, I always set it to matrix, which is the way it comes from the factory. What I found is this camera, depending on which autofocus areas are active, will vary its exposure wildly, and because the finder is oftentimes so bright and varies its brightness wildly depending on what you're focused, it's not always easy to tell what your exposure is. Just know that it's not perfect. It may require some adjustment. Don't fret about it. Just press this button, and you can add exposure to make the pictures lighter, subtract exposures to make them darker. It's still far from perfect. I prefer to set my ISOs automatically, but if I do have to set them manually, I want to set them in full stops. I don't need to go in third stops, and so when I'm clicking around, it goes 3 times as fast. That's in the custom setting menus. Under exposure, B1 under ISO sensitivity step value, I set it to a full stop. Bracketing is no longer a separate button. I never use bracketing with film because I couldn't afford it, and with digital because I don't need it. But in any case, it's in the photo shooting menu, auto bracketing, and this is where you can turn it on and control what brackets and how far up brackets and how many shots are made, and you'll figure it out. A feature that I always leave on, which oddly is off by default, which I find important, is the adaptive delighting, or what I call automatic dynamic range, which actually adapts the camera's dynamic range to whatever it is that you're shooting automatically frame by frame, which I find very important. That's set in the camera menu, active delighting, and I set it to automatic, or you could set it manually. And Nikon's digital cameras have done this since the beginning. The D1 actually had a setting for auto contrast. Picture controls. Personally, I love my vivid images. We find those at the camera icon, set picture control. I shoot my landscape stuff at vivid. I set the sharpening up to +9, the maximum. I do not play with mid-range sharpening. I don't play with the quick sharp. I don't play with anything else. And I do set the saturation. I peg it at +3. Do not do this for people pictures. People will look horrible. They turn weird colors. But for nature stuff, you can argue what you want. It's not natural, but it's what sells. An editor is always, their finger always says, yes, I want that shot when I shoot it with vivid as opposed to not vivid, which is more boring. For auto white balance, we have 4 settings. We have natural light auto, and we have auto, which has 3 settings inside there. I usually shoot overall, leave my camera by default set in auto 1, which gives a great first approximation of the best white balance under every condition, from outdoors to indoors. The keep white setting is if you're shooting indoors in the tungsten lighting and don't want a cozy, warm feel, you want it just stark and pure white, that is your option. Or if you want artificial lighting that's nice and cozy and warm inside a house or a theater, you want to keep it nice and cozy and warm, set it to the Auto 2, keep warm. Auto 1 is a good compromise. If you're only shooting under natural light, and that I define as sunlight, cloudy light, starlight, anything from nature, not an artificial light, not an LED or tungsten bulb or anything like that, set it to natural light auto. And the difference is that in natural light auto, you won't ever have it get too blue on you. In other words, if you shoot a sunset, sometimes it'll get confused in warm afternoon light and think you're shooting under tungsten and cool it down a little bit to make it more technically accurate, but artistically less accurate. That's why if I'm shooting in natural light, I set it to natural light when I'm outdoors or indoors shooting under window light. It also will compensate very well for shade as natural light. I have samples and examples of all this at my written user guide. Follow the links in my description and you can see all these. Here's a practical tip. You'll notice it's set to on, but of course the camera's gone to sleep. Now if I pick it up to my eye and press this, notice it took like half a second to wake up. Well, guess what? When I shoot, you can tell. I want to get it done. I've got better things to do than shoot. I want to get off the fun things. And I want that thing awake the instant I take it to my eye. The trick is simple, but not everyone realizes it. When I go to pick up my camera from around my neck and bring it to my eye, I've already pressed the shutter button as I first start to lift the camera. So in a half a second it takes to get to my eye, it's already awake and on. I set everything I can to automatic, auto ISO, program auto exposure, you name it. And I know when to take something off of auto so that I can when I need to if the camera doesn't figure it out automatically by itself, exposure or whatnot. This way I get my shot much more quickly. The camera usually makes all the choices I want because I preset it to do what I want. And I only take it off of auto if there's something unusual I'm doing. For instance, if I'm on a tripod, I want to force ISO 100. That's one of the few times I take it off of auto ISO. Also, general shooting. The reason I do that is by shooting in program mode. It's sad how many people set manual ISOs and manual exposure, and then each shot is usually shot at something wrong. The reason I set auto ISO and program exposure means that pretty much from daylight to starlight, I'm going to get the best exposure. The only thing I vary is the setting for the minimum shutter speed and auto ISO. That is the shutter speed below which, as it gets darker, the camera starts to increase the ISO to make sure the shutter speed doesn't get any slower than that. And then, depending on my subject, I change that minimum shutter speed to be appropriate for the subject. In other words, I choose the slower shutter speed that still gets me a sharp image. For sports, it might be a 1,000th or a 2,000th, and we set that in ISO settings, minimum shutter speed, and I can set it here. I'll typically use 1 or 2,000th for sports, 1/25th for people, and for general nature and landscape, where the subject is still, but it's my handshaking that I'm trying to work against, I'll choose auto and slower. Maybe slower too. That takes advantage of the VR modes. And by auto, it means it varies it by the focal length of the lens. And I program all those into my U1, U2, and U3 modes, which I'll cover a little later. Image crop modes. I love these. Sadly, this camera lacks a bunch, but I programmed this button, the old movie button. Unfortunately, the only one I use is square or FX, but still, square is important. Not only does it look better for subjects that fit into it, it means in all my sorting programs and all my icons in the images, it gets much bigger to fill a much larger space. But that's personal preference. The shutter modes, the silent electronic mode, mechanical modes, and so forth, they're in the custom setting menu under D, shooting and display, and it's very well hidden at D6, shutter type. Auto does its best to choose what you need. For instance, it goes to electronic shutter when you need a super high speed. Mechanical shutter means it's always going to work well, or things up to an 8,000th of a second. Your choice on how you set these. The shutter sound is actually fairly good on this camera. If you set it to a silent mode, the shutter sound is just loud enough so you know the camera went off, but people around you don't hear it. You go to setup, camera sounds, shutter sound. You can turn it on or off, and then you control to your heart's content how loud and what kind of sound it makes. Frame rates. Well, the easy way to set frame rates is hold the advanced mode down and move the rear dial, single, low, high, and so forth. It doesn't tell you the frames per second here. The only thing it will do is in low, I choose 3 frames per second for low. Why? Because this way I can get off a single shot, one by one. If I want several, I can hold it down. I discovered the default of 5, I can't just get one shot. It usually blows off a few. This goes to 20 frames per second in the electronic shutter mode at H+, and you have full selection of image sizes and image formats like RAW if you want to shoot that. At 30, 60, and 120 frames per second, you get no choices at all. All you do is get one size of a JPEG in normal compression rate. You can't shoot RAW at those rates. Not all the exposure modes work as you'd expect them to, and it gets far too complicated to cover here in a video. Follow my link from my description to my written guide, and it has whole tables telling you what works or not in these various speeds. And watch out, if you're shooting at 120 or those crazy modes, you can get 2.5 gigabytes of JPEGs just shooting a 6-second burst. And guess what? You're shooting so many frames, you can shoot over 10,000 frames when you try to put all those images into the same folder back in your computer. You'll have duplicates. It won't work. Unfortunately, that's a default of the design of the Nikon camera. It only has 4 digits for the file numbers. So after 10,000, which is easy to shoot in half an hour, you really have a problem trying to put them in the same folder for your own archiving. They should have 5 or 6 or more digits, but they don't. Flash is easy. Just pop into Flash, set everything to TTL, and it will balance wonderfully. That's something Nikon has done well since they, for all I know, may have invented TTL Flash back in the 1980s. So when it comes to balanced Flash for Fill Flash outdoors, it's simple. You don't need to worry about it. Put it in any Flash. I prefer the SB400 because it's small and powerful, but to your heart's content, Flash is really important too. You do need that for shooting under contrasty light outdoors for portraits. It keeps people's eyes from getting too dark and lightens up the shadows, so I do recommend that. Not many of you shoot in the studio as I do. All the product photos you see are shot in my studio under studio strobes. And if you do that, you have the camera set manually to say a 250th or whatever the sync speed is at like f22 or f32, which means normally the camera is showing you exactly what the exposure is going to look like through the finder. Well, when you set manual 250th at f22 at ISO 100, you're going to get black through the finder. You have to set the finder to simulate an optical viewfinder, which you do with the custom settings, the shooting display, and you go to the view mode. Now, this is written in the typical Japanese translations here to try to fit into these small spaces. Show effects of settings is the default. That means as you change white balance, exposure compensation, you see that reflected in the finder. Well, when you're shooting under strobes, and the only exposure light is contributed by the strobes, which is a flash that only goes off as you take the picture, Adjust for ease of viewing. Now the finder will always give you a good image, just like an optical finder does, regardless of what the strobes do. For time exposures, you can make manual exposures out to 15 minutes long, which are displayed as 900 seconds long. But you have to enable them at the custom settings menu, shooting display, oddly not exposure, but I didn't program this, extended shutter speeds, leave them on if you want to set manual speeds longer than 30 seconds. So if you want to make a 1.5-minute exposure, you set that to on. Now in simply the manual mode, you'll notice I'm at 200th, 40th, 15th, 2 seconds. Watch this. There's a big jump, though, but too bad. I didn't program this. And that's how you get those exposures. If you want a longer exposure, of course, you can go to bulb or time. Means you press the button, and it's exposing. And here's something relatively new on the Z6 III. You'll notice that it's counting up. What bugs me is, let me know if you found a way to do this. Pressing this illuminator button will not light it up. It won't show on the rear display. So unfortunately, out in the dark, you still have to get out your flashlight, which then I asked myself, well, I'm just going to use my Apple Watch to time this. Sad but true. After 20 years plus of making digital cameras, Nikon still hasn't figured out how to just please show us a timer that we can see in the pitch black or out waiting around making our star trail photos or whatever. If you're doing astronomical work and you don't want to lose your night vision, there's a mode for that. Under custom settings, under D12, called warm display colors. See how it went totally dark and red? That is real good for use in the dark. And you have the options. One mode makes everything dim and red, which means you really can't see the playback at the image, but at least it does not kill your night vision. The other mode will play back the images in regular color, but leave all the menus in dim red. There's a starlight view, which makes the shadows look a little lighter through live view. That's at D11. You can turn that on, and that's personal preference. I haven't found it to be that useful. I don't shoot movies with these. I shoot everything I do with an iPhone or use Panavision or Arri or something like that if I'm serious for real stuff. The way you shoot a video is you select video over here. And the way the camera normally comes, people could also shoot videos by tapping the red button. Image review, you set that in the playback menu under picture review. And what picture review is good old-fashioned. That means a picture pops up on the screen after you took your picture. The finder has automatic brightness control, but it's not very intelligent. So oftentimes it really just sets itself based on where the camera is pointed when you press play. If the lens is pointing down at something dark, the finder will be very dark. So oftentimes I'll point the camera out the window or up at the sky so it thinks it's in a bright location, and then the finder playback image will be much brighter. You can program what the front dial does in playback. I like to have it skip ahead or behind by 10 frames a click, just like Canon does, and that's over here at F3, custom controls, playback. We select the front knob, and then you have your choice. I like frame advance 10. You can do what you want. Voice notes. Here's a trick. Only the pro cameras used to do this. It's very handy that this will record voice notes that attach to the images. So if you're doing news and you want to write down the names of the subjects from left to right and get everybody's spelling correct, or people's phone numbers or contact info or whatever it is you want, so later on you can figure out what the photo was. You go to the custom setting menu, F controls, 3 for playback, and then you select the button and set it to voice memos. In my case, I set this red dot button here to be my voice recording option. And the way you use that is you're playing back an image, you hold this down, it records a memo. Then you tap it again, it plays it back. U1, U2, and U3. Everybody has their preferences. I love these because it automatically and immediately recalls all my settings, autofocus settings, frame rate settings, white balance setting, auto ISO settings, you name it. You can do what you want. I program my U1 for nature landscape, which is usually high resolution, various white balances and so forth. I program U2 for people photos. So I set the saturation all back to normal, and I set the auto ISO to 125th slower shutter speed. And I usually use U3 for either action and sports, which would be about a 1,000th minimum shutter speed, and the natural picture control, as well as autofocus 3D tracking or autofocus all area selection. Or I might set my U3 to studio shots, which is manual exposure. Set the finder the way I showed you before. Set the manual exposure to the flash sync speed and say f22, ISO 100, and the white balance to what I had preset with a gray card to my studio strobes. And you think this takes a while to talk about. There's more settings that I use for each of these. And by having them programmed into this, that, and this, I can go from one assignment to the next so much more easily. Or for instance, if I'm photographing people and something scenic catches my eye, boom, there's one click here and I'm good to go. I'm not going to get into the details of all my settings because I've logged them at my written user's guide and the link is in my description. I also save all the settings to a card. If you really want to, you can download those to your own card, stick that in your camera, and load them back into your camera. And all the explanations as well as the files are up at my website. I will caution that sometimes it includes the very difficult to enter copyright information, where I have my name, address, phone number, and all that embedded into each of my files. You do want to check that and make sure you update that to your information. Otherwise, your pictures will be marked as Ken Rockwell's pictures. And that's it. I talk fast. I apologize for that, but I want to get this covered. If you really want to use any of this information, by all means, please go to the written website, kenrockwell.com. Follow the link in my description, or use my search box where all this is explained and written down. It makes a whole lot more sense. Thank you very much for watching Ken Rockwell here on kenrockwell.com and kenrockwell.tv.